Welcome today to our interview. My name is Ashley Witcher. I am a senior academic consultant here at BeMo, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Meng Yang. And we're here today to interview soon-to-be Dr. Rishi Patel. And Rishi has recently started medical school in Iowa at the Carver College of Medicine. And we're really excited to have him today to share how he navigated the medical school application process as a reapplicant and succeeded. And we hope this interview will give you some great strategies to help you on your journey as well. And Rishi worked with us in 2020, and we helped him with the personal statement and activities sketch, as well as the secondary and finally the interviews. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rishi. And we would like to start by asking you if you could tell us a bit about your background.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad to be here. So, yeah, I'll start off by telling a bit about my background. So, I'm originally from Southern California. I went to college at the University of California, Berkeley, where I studied molecular and cellular biology. I originally applied to medical school, my first attempt during the summer of 2019. During that time, I did not get into any medical schools that cycle, so I graduated in December 2019. I took a gap year and a half in the end and reapplied with the help of BeMo in the summer of 2020. And then I started medical school here at the University of Iowa in August 2021. So I'm about 2 years and 2 months into medical school. And yeah, so that's a bit about me.
Great. Thank you so much for that really clear introduction. And so you mentioned that you're a reapplicant, so that's definitely something that we would like you to talk about. But I'd like to start off a little bit further in your history and just ask you, was there some kind of specific experience that you had that first introduced you to the idea of medicine as a career path?
Yeah, so like the way I like to think about it for myself is that I've had like when I was younger, this is even before high school, I had really two big kind of experiences with medicine, and they're kind of juxtapose each other. One was very acute and a single incident, and one was more chronic, but not quite as intense. So the one that was more chronic is I had asthma throughout my childhood. It was very well managed. I never ended up being hospitalized or anything like that, and all things considered, was not a major deterrent to my childhood, but every once in a while it would flare up and we'd have to go see my pediatrician and they'd, have to adjust my medication or things like that. But I was pretty consistently taking essentially, it was well managed with the medication regimen that I was on as a kid. And then kind of secondly to that, I had one incident as a child where I ran into a door, and this was a really scary moment for my family. And this was just like blood everywhere, and we were actually at outside of our home in at our uncle's house. So the ambulance came, and I eventually had to get like emergency surgery, but it all worked out. And so as I look kind of when I got older and I reflected on those two moments, I realized that in both cases, kind of modern medicine and the kind of the doctor's like knowledge and experience really allowed me to have these potentially problematic situations resolve themselves without really much impact on my life, all things considered. And I think that was really instrumental to me having like a normal, happy, healthy childhood. And I think personally experiencing those things and seeing the impact knowing about medicine and knowing how to treat these things can have really inspired me to go into the field. So I entered college pretty set on doing medicine, and then throughout my undergraduate science classes and shadowing experiences, I never really went away from it. So that this further encouraged me to pursue medicine.
So Rishi, you had these fairly early experiences with medicine, and you said that you basically knew before you even entered college that this is what you wanted to do. So did you plan ahead and figure out what you needed to do to prepare yourself for a career in medicine? You mentioned that you had shadowing experiences and volunteer experiences in college. I'm wondering if those were very much planned in advance, if you knew you had to do that before you even started them.
Yeah, I think like I had talked to people and done some basic internet research, even before I started college. I knew like kind of the big things I needed to do, get good grades, research, volunteering, eventually take the MCAT. So I kind of had a roadmap for that. And I think my sophomore year of college, that is, I started volunteering at a local hospital. My junior year, I started a shadowing program. So I had thought about those things in advance and kind of did follow through with my plan for the most part that I had set off with at the beginning of college.
It's interesting because I guess you can see that, you know, being prepared for a career in medicine, having planned ahead, still there were bumps along the road because we already know that you're a reapplicant, right?
Exactly.
We already know that it didn't work out for you the first time, and we'll explore a little bit more about why, but I did want to just mention that here to our audience. There's so much to the whole process that sometimes even when you plan in advance, even when you know so early on that you have to do these things and prepare yourself in this way and explore the profession through shadowing, volunteering, research, all of that stuff, even then it can be a very, very challenging process. So I think that really sets the tone for this interview.
Yeah, I would definitely second that. That's I think a theme throughout the whole medical school journey is that you know, we all try to plan ahead and do the right things that will set us up for future success, but there is a bit of uncertainty to it, and it's not going to go to always according to plan, and that's all right, but you should do the things that you know will improve your chances because at the end of the day, you want to give yourself the best shot. So I really liked how you summarized that.
And so it sounds like you had lots of experiences. We would like to know as well, just for other people listening in, especially, how were your MCAT and GPA when you applied? Were these something that you had to work on as a reapplicant, or they were pretty good?
So I actually think for all things considered, I had a pretty strong kind of academic and numerical background going into even my first application cycle. I did not actually retake the MCAT between my first and second applications, and I don't think my GPA fluctuated all that much. I had a little bit above a 3.9, and I had a 5.23 on my MCAT. So I do not think those were the things that actually hindered my application the first time around. The things that really I think prevented me from getting in the first time around is I was just very delayed with my secondaries, which is something I know we'll talk about more, but I was I was probably averaging somewhere between a month and 2 months in turnaround time for those, which is well above, we'll talk about it later, the 2-week kind of goal you should be aiming for. So I think that was really what held me back the first time, and getting that corrected helped me a lot the second time around.
So you had the experiences, you had the grades and the MCAT score. So, you know, beyond those things, the numerical things, the non-cognitive traits, and all the wonderful experiences that you had to bring to the table, it's also about how you even approach the application process, right? So it's almost like there's 3 factors, and it's a little bit more than just the holistic approach to ensuring that you're well-rounded in all areas. It's the application process itself can be quite critical to your success.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I mean, in some ways, the application process is this like ultimate step. You've probably been, at least 4 years or so of preparing for applying to med school, probably more if you think about high school and all the work you put in. So even though it's the very last thing, it's like it is extremely important, even though it's maybe not as much time as the other things. So you want to make sure you do it right and are doing it to your best ability, because I'm living proof that sometimes if you don't do the right things, there are consequences, and you can come back from that. But preferably everyone listening to this, hopefully for those who are first-time applicants, will just get in the first time by using the strategies we discussed today.
Yeah, absolutely. They can learn from you, hopefully, rather than having to learn the hard way.
That's the goal, right? Yes, that's the goal.
Yeah. So let's go through that process, if you don't mind. You found out that you're probably waiting for an interview invite, and it didn't happen. What was the first thing that you did? Did you kind of like regroup and decide that you needed to start working on your next application, or did you do something else?
So there was definitely 2 parts of it. I knew I needed to. So I graduated around December or January, and by December or January, I was pretty sure I was not going to get in that cycle. I had not gotten any interviews. I didn't even get any interviews that first cycle because I was so late on my secondaries. And because of that, I knew I needed to figure out the reapplication part, but it was kind of farther away. So first thing I needed to figure out was just like what I was going to do in my gap year. So I kind of figured that out. I decided I would just continue doing research in the lab I had been doing research with as a undergrad, So that, I figured it out. And then I knew I started thinking about it, maybe in February, March, just like how I was going to approach my application process and things I wanted to improve on. And that eventually led me to, seeking outside help through BeMo. And, after that, the ball just started rolling and I was able to kind of put together a plan for pursuing the application a second time.
So you worked, essentially you stayed with one research job the whole time. And was that a year or that was 18 months?
Yeah, so it was so I actually started here, there was a summer program here for med school. So I essentially was doing that, you could say January 2020 to about May 2021. So maybe, so that's about, 18 months, maybe a little bit less, but I did event. So that was essentially the only thing I did for my gap year and a half.
Did you find that it was beneficial to you in any way to just have that one main responsibility, one main obligation during this time? Because I know that some people during their gap year, they try to engage themselves in a lot of different activities, maybe to help with the application or something. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really helpful, and I'll kind of explain that for two reasons. The first is I was able to essentially, treat my research job as like I was a full 40-hour-a-week job. I did it kind of like you would do any other job. And I think having that much time, in undergrad, I was maybe doing, 10, 15, 20 hours a week of research, but having a kind of your full time and effort committed to that allowed me to make a lot more progress without having to necessarily make like sacrifices in other areas of my life. So I think that's good for, especially when you're talking about your gap year. It's easier to identify one thing you did really well than maybe lots of different things you made small contributions to. And when it comes to writing certain secondaries or talking about it in interviews, it's easier to explain one big thing, just because these things are, there are word counts and time limits. And then the kind of on top of that, I think it's hard to imagine until you do it how much time secondaries will take when you get to that time in the summer. And some people are definitely more naturally talented at it than others, but it takes a lot of time. So if you're already, kind of working at your maximum, working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, it's really hard to add the secondaries on top of that. So I think having that one thing and then just adding the secondaries on top of that, I could, during those months, I was able to, talk to the lab and my PI about like doing a little bit, they understood that I was a little bit busy. You don't need to completely forget about it, but they understand that you might have to be have other things going on. So I think overall, it's just easier. The secondaries are an important part of your application, and we'll talk about them more later in this webinar, I'm sure, but you want to make sure you have the time to really give it your best effort. And usually that means you can't be doing a ton of things outside of it. So it's nice to be, I think, able to focus on one or maybe two things during your gap year.
Mm-hmm. And it definitely paid off for you that second round because you were able to devote quality time to completing your applications. There's no point in engaging yourself in too many activities only then to not get in again because you just couldn't carve out enough time to actually do the application itself. Right, that'll be probably a recurring theme, I think, during this interview is that focusing on the application process being such an important part of like actually getting yourself in. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. It is. It's sometimes it seems like something you just it doesn't seem as like tangible as maybe like your volunteering or your research, but it is something you need to spend a significant amount of time on, and it is really important. Like we'll try to hit on again and again in this webinar, so just keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the secondaries, because you have to think about every school that you apply to is going to ask you between maybe 2 and 7 questions in your secondaries, in addition to the whole primary application. So considering that, how did you go about selecting your schools? Did you change the schools that you applied to, and how many schools did you apply to?
Yeah, so I applied to about 30 schools, and I, as a reapplicant, had an initial list. This, the schools I applied to the first time around, and I did change that. I would say about a third of those I did change. I was coming from California, where I'm originally from, so like I kept most of the California schools, the in-state schools. The ones I mainly changed were some of the out-of-state, the out-of-state schools, and particularly this, like, after the first time, after having gotten no acceptances, I was going to play much more conservatively and safe. So I did kind of remove the the highest ranked schools from my list and try to replace them with some more kind of like schools that I thought I had a better chance at getting into. And in fact, the school I am at right now, the University of Iowa, I actually did not apply to my first time around when I applied to medical school. And in terms of when you're thinking about your list more in general, I think the things you do want to think about are, I think you want to be very intentional and about what schools you're going to apply to. First off, you're spending a lot of money and time and at these schools, so you want to make sure you're using your resources efficiently. But also just think about like this, you want to this like it's something I think everyone like knows you have to put in effort into your secondaries and your interviews, but this is something you also want to put in effort in because you're not going to apply to 100 medical schools, right? You have a fixed number of shots at the target, and you want to make sure you're shooting at a target you want to go to. So, and also shooting at a target school that you can go into, to try to use that analogy. So one thing is, if you are looking to apply out of state, and I know that's not everyone, make sure it's a school that accepts out of state applicants. There are schools that do not accept a lot of out of state applicants, and you should like look into that before you apply there. So there's a lot of great resources for that. I know BeMo has a list I actually had used where it's kind of a blog post where they list some schools that are known to accept a lot of out-of-state applicants. That's like especially valuable if you're coming from California or something like that. But there's also the kind of the raw data is from like that NSAR table. And there you can really get like the peer numbers, like how many in-state people applied, how many in-state get in, how many out-of-state applied, how many out-of-state get in. I think that's a very basic level of where you want to think about it. And then, there's definitely other things, people should consider. Is this a place you want to live? Do you want to maybe be in a big, like kind of like a bigger academic center, or are you interested in being attached to a bigger undergraduate university? Everyone will have different factors, but I think it's important that spend some time thinking about the things you value in a medical school, because you want to, at the end of the day, make sure where you're applying to are places you want to go, because you're going to be there a lot, 4 years. It's going to be a big part of your life, so try to make the most of that.
Yeah, and I like what you said, being intentional about the schools that you select, because another thing that you will have to do down the road probably is to answer that question, why our program, either in your secondaries or in the interviews. And if you've already thought about this thoroughly when you even selected your schools, that process will be much easier for you to come up with really genuine answers to those questions. Otherwise, you're just going to be trying to pull something together that may not even feel true to you. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and you can do the work ahead of time, so those questions are easier when you have to inevitably answer them.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And I really like what you said about in-state versus out-of-state. And as you said, you're attending a school that you didn't even apply to the first time, which is out-of-state. So it's really important for students to look at these stats and also understand them, right? So it's not only how many students got in out-of-state, but how many applicants were there out-of-state versus how many students got in, because sometimes it's like one student out-of-state. So that's important for students to look up ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
So you've selected your schools, you are beginning to think about the primary application. What's the first thing that you do in terms of the primary application?
Yeah, so in terms of the primary application, right, they're kind of the two main things you have to, I think, put a lot of effort into thinking about are your activities section, outside of the school choice, that is your activity section and your personal statement. And both are important. I think my initial effort was a lot more geared towards the personal statement. So I started off with I was working with BeMo. I had a brainstorm session with one of the counselors, advisors from BeMo about this. What should I do? Because I had an existing personal statement that was, did not get me in the first time. So there was definitely work to be improved upon there. And so I just had to, I just worked with him and thought of what are ways I should improve it, what kind of set up my process for rewriting it in total. So I started writing it in actually probably somewhere around April. And I think we agreed upon a rule where I was going to try to rewrite one paragraph a day. And to start with, I actually did not completely rewrite my personal statement from scratch. Now, I think for some people that, that is something you should at least consider and talk to someone who knows about whether it is worth rewriting. For me personally, I was pretty confident that the issue with my application had been my delayed secondary, so I didn't feel the need to completely rewrite my personal statement, and I was pretty happy with at least like the message I was trying to convey and the skeleton of it. I felt it was very true to myself. I think the issue for me was, I could have, written it better, maybe both like this like stylistically, but also this like, the word choice and structure. And I think the biggest thing I changed from kind of the first time to the second time is something many of you might have heard before, but it's sometimes harder to implement than it is when you hear it, and that's like you really need to show and not tell. And so, I think it is a lot stronger when you aren't trying to tell the reader that I am a certain way, or this experience impacted me this way. Just try to, tell the story and leave a little bit open to interpretation, because if you tell the story the right way, the reader will pick up on what you're trying to tell. It's okay to like nudge them in the right direction, but you don't need to say like, oh, I'm a very thoughtful person, or I'm very compassionate. Let the story do the telling. And what you can learn to appreciate maybe later on is that these application readers are, reading a large volume of essays, and sometimes they're not spending as much time as you might think they are, kind of glaring over every word. So you have to like think like, what are they going to remember from this when they read it maybe one time over, two times over, and like going it pretty fast, right? So they'll remember like the story, the interesting parts, right? They won't necessarily remember every other word you said, right? So think about it big picture that way. Don't lose sight of the trees with the focusing on every word. It's important to use good word choice and all that, but sometimes I think people get too caught up in the weeds. Focus on telling a story that you think will leave a good impression in the evaluator's minds.
Yeah, there's so many things that you said in responding to Ashley's question that I agree with. As someone who reads a lot of these personal statements too, I think what is really important to emphasize is that you want to be memorable. And just from personal experience, I know I've read a lot of essays where traits are just being thrown at me, like empathy, compassion, professionalism, all of these kinds of things. But the ones that stick in my mind are, I remember some of my students, I still remember some of my students in like unique experiences with a single patient that they talked about in their essay, or their unique experience with someone that they interacted with when they volunteered at a homeless shelter. I remember those things, from this cycle, from last cycle even, but I don't remember the ones that were just lists of traits, because that blends in with all of the other essays that I've read. And so, yeah, you definitely want to be able to achieve that when your reader sees your essay and can create a personal link, an attachment to a story that you've expressed in your essay, that can be so much more powerful.
Yes, I completely agree. And it's kind of this like everyday life, right? Like you remember the stories, like for people right? You remember specific stories about them. And I think that really resonates with me most. That's what you remember about people in your own life, and that's what the evaluators will remember about you if you do it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you make a lot of really good points. And so you have some space within the personal statement, of course, to share some stories. Often you can share around 2 to 3 experiences, but where you have less space is the activity sketch. This can be really challenging for students to get these experiences and ideas out. So can you tell us a little bit about how you chose for your activity sketch, and also for those 3 most meaningful experiences as well?
Yeah, so I again was working off, the skeleton I had started with from kind of my first pass, and in terms of filling the activity section, 15 can seem like quite daunting. That was at least the number when I applied. I believe it's the same. I assume it hasn't changed. And I think if you should try to fill it up as much as you can. Not every activity has to be kind of your classic volunteering or research or whatever, kind of your cookie cutter med school applicant, you can, you can pick things like hobbies and kind of smaller things you've done along the way. If you do have, and so it's okay, there are some, it's okay if you can only get to 12 or 13 or something, but you want to try to get as close to 15 as possible. And then if you do have more than 15, which is, great, I would focus on eliminating the ones that are repetitive or that don't really add something that something else has, especially, if, for example, you have like multiple research labs, right? It's, if you feel, especially if you have like more than 2, like 3, at the end of the day, they're all kind of telling you the same thing. And if it's just, if you already hit that point, maybe it's better to hit, focus your limited word count elsewhere. And this is probably not as critical with the general 15 list, because by the time you get to the 15th activity, typically they are more minor activities for the majority of us. But especially when you're picking the 3, which is a place, they do give you, I think, pretty substantial word count for explaining why those 3 activities are your most meaningful. And I think so you should really be deliberate and intentional with picking those 3. And the advice I give you is it doesn't have to be necessarily, your favorite activity. It doesn't have to be, or things that you just enjoyed the most. Those are important, and those often do end up being the same one people pick, but you want to be strategic in using those 3. So find 3 things that, are going to be valuable to your application. So they should typically, I think, illustrate 3 different qualities or attributes or kind of important things about your application that you'd like to convey to the admissions committee. And they should also be things that are easy to write about. So if you're comparing between 2 activities, one of which just has these like a really great story that you think would make a really nice written, significant section, and the other one doesn't have that, it's okay to use that as the tiebreaker. Sometimes I think being very practical about this application and realizing that certain things are easier to write about, and certain things allow you to demonstrate a personal trait for yourself that other activities don't, it's okay to pick that. So I think an example would be like, you probably should not pick like 2 research labs for your most significant, because ultimately they're probably going to be showing the same things. So just be strategic about it. I think for the most part, it usually, if you use this kind of those 2 things I was talking about, things that are easy to write about and things that show different aspects of your personality, you'll be able to get it down to 3 rather easily.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rishi, you mentioned earlier in your answer that you should try to max out your 15, and I want to push back on that just a little bit, because and I'll give you a chance to say what you feel about this, but sometimes by trying to push yourself to fill out the 15 activities, you end up actually forgetting that quality is more important than quantity. And I certainly have read activities, sketches, where there are a couple of activities in there that just, that just don't do much for me. They don't inform me about the applicant or their traits or their qualities. They just seem like they're there to fill in the space. What do you recommend for that?
I think, I actually agree with what you're saying. I think I actually, both times I applied, probably got to like 10 or 12, but not to 15. And there's certain things that it's not going to, have the same impact as like your typical like research lab you spend 2 years in. I know some people put like awards in there, and those are fine. I definitely think if you, I almost feel like the rule of thumb, if you feel like you're stretching it, you probably are. And I don't think, like, you have to realize with the amount of applications that these committees run through, it's not like your 14th activity is really going to make the difference. They might be glancing at the title and then skimming it, if anything, because they really do get thousands and maybe tens of thousands of applications a year. So it's, I would, if you feel like you're pushing it, I would just be conservative on it. Especially, I know some people do have like a hobby section, which is fine, but I don't know if you have a different opinion, especially on this specific thing, but I would just group all your hobbies together, things like that, because some of these things you don't want to, seem like you're getting to 15 just for the sake of getting for 15.
Yeah, for hobbies, I would say, it's nice for them to see that you're a well-rounded person and that you have interests outside of things that are very directly, obviously related to medicine. That's nice. Maybe, I would say choose the most significant hobby. Like, you don't have to throw in every single interest that you have, but put in something, if you have one that's really significant, that does demonstrate something about you that would be appreciated by the admissions committee, then yeah, for sure. And you make a really great point about the limited time that the admissions committee member who's reading your application has to do that. And both for the personal statement and for the activity sketch, you want to respect their time, right? Don't just put words down because you have the space. You want to put words down that they'll actually appreciate reading. And I think it also saves you work in the end for the applicant, right? Why spend the extra hours just trying to fluff up your application when you can just leave it at those, top 10 activities that really have made an impact in your life and will make an impact in your application.
Yeah, that's well said.
Yeah, I agree with both of what you said. I always like to tell students, everything that you include in any part of your application should be doing work for you. So you need to ask yourself, why am I including this? And Rishi, you make a really great point. You want to highlight certain characteristics, right? And you want to show them that you're unique and that you're a qualified candidate, essentially. So thank you for sharing about the activities sketch. And so that is the primary application for AMCAS. And I believe you said that you didn't apply elsewhere, so you didn't go through TM, DSAS, or apply to DO.
You are correct. I only applied through AMCAS both the first and second time.
Okay, so once you've submitted your primary application, you generally have a little bit of time between that and the secondaries. What did you do in this time?
So this is what I'm about to say, that if you only listen to one part of this webinar, if you only remember one part of the webinar, this is the part. So you should get your primary application in, I think within a few days. I would say, if you can get it in the day it opens or the day after it opens, do yourself a favor. So that's typically June 1st. You two can correct me if I'm wrong. And then you essentially have all of June in which you're waiting for secondaries, which typically show up July 1st. I know the second year, the time I applied, it was like July 10th. Let's just call it a month. Let's just call it the month of June. So this, if you can only listen to this one part of the webinar, I'm telling you, pre-write all your secondaries in June. Do it strategically. Work really hard and work very efficiently in June to get those secondaries done ahead of time. And I can talk about more details in a second, but do it. You'll save yourself so much kind of stress, and you'll be so thankful you did when those secondary emails start coming, because they will, you'll wake up one day, check your email, and you'll have like 15 emails saying these secondaries are available, and it gets overwhelming really quickly. But if you're one of the smart people, or the kind of proactive people who pre-wrote them in June, you'll save yourself a ton of work, and that'll just, you'll kind of be starting the race with a huge lead. And that's will allow you to get interviews sooner and allow you to get into medical school sooner. And you could potentially be into medical school by early fall if you kind of follow through with this. And that this was a huge kind of weight off your back. So rewrite those secondaries in June. So I can go into kind of we can talk about the details of how to do that, but yeah, kind of the big takeaway, please pre-write your secondaries in June. I didn't do that the first time around. I greatly regretted doing that, and I changed that. I think that was a big help when I did it the second time around.
Yeah, Rishi, we certainly want you to explain what it means to pre-write secondaries, because I'm sure some people who are listening to this interview are probably going to be asking that question. What do you mean pre-write them? I don't even have the questions yet, right? So yeah, we will ask you to talk about that. But before you do, I just want to make a comment here, just to highlight once again the importance of timing in this process and why it's important. The AMCAS application that Rishi went through, is on a rolling basis. And, you know, for those of you listening who may not be as familiar yet, what that means is the system opens and there's no like strict deadline for when you have to submit everything. Schools will have their deadlines, but they're going to be much later. And so the reason why it's beneficial for everyone to, well, for you to submit your application as soon as possible at every single stage is because as they come in, the review committees are looking at them and sending out secondaries. And then once the secondaries start coming in, they start reviewing them and sending out interview invitations. And so the earlier you get something in, the greater the chance, because the bigger the pool of available seats there are, right? And so that's what Rishi means by you can get into medical school earlier, which is pretty exciting. If you are one of the first people to submit your primaries and one of the first people to submit your secondaries and one of the first people to interview, you could have that acceptance letter, you know, before the year is over. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to like, you know, coming, you know, most of us the last time, most of the people who apply to medical school, you know, their main application experience is like college, and college admission is typically not rolling. And like I said before, my first time around, I did not get the secondaries in kind of the rule is usually 2 weeks. You two can, you know, correct me if there's a better rule you found in practice, but I know it's hard to it's sometimes hard to imagine, but when we mean like rolling, like it is extremely rolling to the point that in my experience, like I don't think a lot of, if you are waiting like a month or so to submit them, I don't know a lot of people who get in, let alone interview of the people who wait like a month or more. And one of the ways to think about it is it's not just you who's trying to get into medical school. These medical schools are also trying to figure out who they want to accept. So it's in their advantage to figure out who they want to interview earlier. So that's why they do this. So this thing is rolling, and there is kind of it changes fast. If you're within those 2 weeks, you're good. But if you spend much more time than that, it's like what happened to me the first time around. It'll be really problematic. And so I can explain now what I mean by pre-writing the secondaries. So, you know, all these schools will send you like, actually was saying before, between 2 and 7 secondaries, you know, varies a little bit school to school. And for the most part, they're pretty consistent year to year. As you can imagine, they're not looking to change their secondaries every year because it's a lot of work, and maybe the evaluators are used to reading what they're used to reading. So you can, you know, go, you know, there's like you can Google, and there's lots of websites where you can find historical secondary prompts. And so, you know, for, let's say you're applying to University X, you Google what was their secondary prompts like last year. You know, maybe you can compare last year to the year before that to see if it was consistent. Really, I think last year would be fine. And look at that. I would say this is a starting point. Look at this, get that list for that school, put it on a Google document or a Microsoft Word document, and then compare that do that for every school. So, you know, this document is going to get long kind of fast, but I think if you start with that, the one thing I think you can take away at this stage is a lot of these prompts, they might be worded a little bit different, but there's probably, like, if you were categorizing it, maybe 10 plus or minus 5 question types that every school is asking. So they might use different words and phrase it in different ways, but there's some broad types. So some will be like, oh, what experience did you show resilience in? Or why are you interested in our school? Maybe they'll be like, what field of medicine are you interested in? Academic, private practice. Now there might be a question about like, how does COVID change your perspective on medicine, or things like that? Or what diversity or kind of special quality do you anticipate bringing to our school? And then if you're a reapplicant like me, you know, we all dread it, but you have to get ready to answer that dreaded, what has changed about your application that we should accept you this time? So I listed maybe 4 or 5 there, and there's probably, you know, some 5 to 10 more. But the whole point of that is these questions they're not just all random. So if you compare a couple of schools, there will be some overlap, and that's helpful because you can write what are these like common skeletons that will allow you to be more efficient. So you might have 3 schools that are all asking you about a time you showed resilience. So write something where you talk about a time you showed resilience. It can be, you know, same for all of them. And then you might have to adjust the word count for each of them. And if one maybe question is asking about resilience in a particular way, or has like a particular way you think it would be best to write it, you change it for that. But that general approach is how you should be thinking about it. You want to look at everything you have, and you want to have all these, as much as you can, you want to have it pre-written. So ideally you'd have every secondary from last year, I think, written before July 1st. I know that sounds like a lot, but it will be a big, a big like weight off your back. And then when they actually do come out in July, you can see if maybe the prompts changed, or if they reworded it, or if maybe it is a completely new prompt, and adjust there. But that's a lot less work than the person who's starting from scratch on July 1st. And if you do this right, you can submit very quickly. You might not even have to wait the 2 weeks. You might, be hitting it the day sending it in the day they send it to you. And that's great, because you'll be the first one they read. And then the first day they send out interviews will be to people like you. So I know it can create a very stressful, not stressful, but just very busy June for you, but it'll be saving you from a lot of stress in the future. And this is how you this is kind of like, it becomes a domino effect. You do the work in June, and then there is more work later on, but that's how you set yourself up to get multiple admittances, not in like the spring, but really in the fall. And that can be really awesome, because then you don't have to worry about it, in the spring, and you can really kind of enjoy your life and between your acceptance and when you start medical school. So I know that was a lot, but this takeaway, pre-write your secondaries in June, and it'll set yourself up for really good fortune in the future.
Early bird gets the worm. I think that's
Perfect.
the saying. Yeah.
Yep, that's it.
Definitely applicable when it comes to med school applications.
This is what we always tell our students: start early. If they don't take anything else, from our webinars and different sessions that we have with them, always start early. It sounds like you had a really good strategy as well, where you actually looked at the previous year's questions and then just tweak them based on if the questions change, which I think is a great strategy. And you actually mentioned one question, which I think you called it the dreaded question. So I'd like us to talk about it specifically for reapplicants. And the question is something like, what have you done differently as a reapplicant? Or it's framed around that. And how would you suggest going about answering that question?
Yeah, so I think that can be a really difficult question as a reapplicant, because I think it's just something no one, sometimes you just wish you didn't have to write about it, because it can be somewhat awkward and uncomfortable. But I think the good thing about it is it's not like the personal statement, in that in your personal statement you have to think about your whole life, and what all those things drove you to pursue medicine, and what you hope to get out of medicine. But with most people, with your gap year, or at least since you last applied, there's only a certain amount of things that have happened in that year or so, right? So just think about those things that happened, and whether sometimes it doesn't really matter how what you did exactly, but you just have to figure out what you did that was relevant to medicine, and focus again on showing, not telling. So, and I think kind of this leading off that, focus on one, maybe two things, but I think one is typically better, because this is a secondary, and some of these word counts are a lot less than you might think. There's a bit of a variety, but focus on one thing, tell a story, and what they're asking you is really, how did these last 12 months change you and make you a better applicant, a better future physician, right? So tell that story, and tell about a specific attribute or a specific skill you maybe gained that is showing that you're more qualified than you were last time, because that's what they're really interested in at the end of the day. And so I think if you focus on that, it's not too bad. And you just have to kind of write it, and I think it'll come together.
Yeah, you make a really good point. It's not about necessarily listing all of the different things that you did and just leaving it at that, but really showing them, okay, this is what I did, this is what I learned from this experience, so that's how I'm going to become a better applicant. I think you really hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah, demonstrating the growth in that period is super, super important, because if nothing changed about you and you got rejected last time, then why should they accept you this time? That's the question,
exactly.
Right?
And another thing, I think one thing some students have, written about in the past, I've heard of is like people will say, this time around I worked more on my application. Like I could have said I wrote my secondaries earlier this time, which is true and great and maybe definitely important. But you just don't want to say that because at the end of the day, they're not interested in that. And what really the basis for that question should always be something that can be found in your activities section, because those are the kinds of things that are really contributing to medicine. They're not so worried about that. The AMCAS is kind of like external to that. So even if you did spend more time on your application, that's good. Just don't talk about that in that question. I know that's a common pitfall.
Yeah, they'll be able to see that in your application. You don't have to say it.
Yeah. So that kind of completes your primary and your secondary application. Now, there is something else before interviews that a lot of students have to go through, which I think some candidates don't even really realize at the beginning, and this is something called CASPer. And for those of you watching or listening to this, CASPer is a situational judgment test, and it's used by many medical schools as well as other programs to assess non-cognitive attributes and essentially gauge a candidate's suitability for the medical profession. And it asks different types of scenario questions, sometimes policy or personal type questions, and the applicant has to respond in a written form to 3 questions per station, usually within about 5 minutes, and there's 12 stations to this. What did you find challenging about the preparation? And what was your strategy for preparing for this?
Yeah, so I think I took it both times, as I mentioned earlier. I actually, the second time around, I took it in June, I believe, even after I had submitted my primary, and that I didn't realize that the score is only good for about a year. So for those, and I believe that's accurate. You two can fact check me on that if I'm misspeaking here. But for those who are reapplying, who may have taken the CASPer before, do be aware of that. You will have to retake it again. It's pretty convenient, all things considered. You just take it on your own computer. But I studied for maybe like a week in advance, doing some practice questions overnight. And I think the challenge for it is kind of this, there are these classical ethical dilemmas where there's a trade-off between kind of what the moral or the rule book would say in a certain situation, and your like personal empathy or towards a person so you're trying to evaluate that trade-off, and also sometimes they ask you about your personal experiences where you may have been in a situation like this, and a lot of these things I think we could, an average person, an average medical school applicant could talk through and kind of reason out to a good kind of conclusion or a good answer given the time and thus the time to do so. But also it's easier. Some of these things are easier if you can verbalize it out. But it's a written test, so you have to like learn to say these things in a time scenario, but also do it succinctly, because there's no one there to ask you any follow-up questions. They're going to evaluate what you put on the paper. So you just want to practice doing that. And for some of us, if you're not the best typist, even getting used to that can take, some time. So my main recommendation would be, I think ideally I would actually take it before I apply, like take it in the spring or sometime. Just get it out of the way. It's one less thing to worry about, and spend a little bit of time preparing. I don't think you need to spend months and months, but it is something they consider. And I think some schools especially really value it. So spend some time preparing, do some practice questions. There's, I think, a free sample they give you, and there's lots of, similar types that's online if you do a Google search, and I know BeMo has some resources for that as well. But the key is this, to practice, practice writing it out under time conditions, get used to that, practice like the actual test is going to be. And if you need extra motivation, I think there's actually a very strong connection looking back between the types of questions that you're asked to respond to on CASPer and some of those MMI type questions in the med school interviews. So this is kind of an investment you're making up front, but it'll come back and pay dividends later. So don't worry about it too much, but just like a lot of these things, do the work, be diligent about it, and it will work out okay. The main thing is, I think, just getting used to the format of the test, which is maybe a little bit different than what we do in our average lives.
So yeah, CASPer and MMI were developed by the same people.
Oh, I did not know that. Yeah.
Yeah, by the same institution. So you're absolutely right that they feel very similar because there's a reason behind that. And you can really think about them as kind of sister assessments. One is just the written form and one is the verbal form, in-person form. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of similarities. So like you said, preparing for one can already add to your preparation for something that you will probably have to do down the road. So it's never a waste of your time, and definitely doing it in a way that simulates the actual experience is very, very helpful. It is not effective if all you're doing is running through answers in your head and not timing yourself. I would even say time yourself and also make sure you have those 12 consecutive prompts and 3 question stems so that you get the feel for how long the entire test takes. Because with this one, a big thing is you just get fatigued halfway through. I've seen that a lot when working with students on CASPer. It's like their answers are good, and then it's like the quality of their answers just drops at one point because I can tell they probably just got really tired. So it takes a little bit of stamina even to do well on the CASPer. And so, simulating that for yourself and running through a couple of full length practice simulations, whether, it doesn't matter if you do it with like BeMo or anyone else, or, you set it up for yourself, but just make sure you get that realistic practice.
Yeah, and I think a lot of students can relate to it from like thinking about their MCAT. When you take the MCAT, sometimes, you can do maybe an individual passage and you're like, oh, I'm doing well on this, but there is something to, taking the full length and taking it under time, right? Sometimes you can do a passage really well if you're not timed, but just think about it like you're an athlete, right? You have to prepare under realistic conditions if you want to get the best performance. And at the end of the day, you want to, do the best on the test you can. So prepare well. The one caveat I forgot to mention that is, with the CASPer, it is, all the practice you look at isn't graded. There's not a right answer, which can make it a little, challenging to evaluate yourself as you're preparing. But I think a lot of the benefit is just getting used to it and making sure you're justifying yourself in a good and like reasonable way. And a lot of times, I think if you look at the prompt, you can kind of understand where they'd want you to go just based on your own understanding of ethics or whatever, if that's needed. But it is something where you're not going to get a grade at the end of the day like you might with the MCAT or some other test you've taken.
For sure. Yeah, with those scenario type questions that are most common on the CASPer, where you're given a situation and you're asked what you would do or how you would navigate something specific about it, it definitely, you want to have a structure in mind, be able to recognize patterns, and be able to recognize the themes that might come up. So like you said, I think ethics is a huge one. Ethical dilemmas is a huge one, but there might be even more nuances. Like it might be touching on something about confidentiality, and you want to be able to have an idea of how you would navigate a situation that involves confidentiality, or patient consent, which is very much related. Patient autonomy, again, very much related. Yeah, and something to note is that, the scenarios that you're given, they're not necessarily related to medicine, right? You probably recall that, Rishi. They're not necessarily related to the profession that you are entering. They could be everyday scenarios, but you still need to demonstrate the qualities that they're looking for in a future position. Absolutely. Now, I know that you had a slightly some good advice for people who are taking the CASPer and maybe don't know how to approach those personal questions, the ones that ask you about relating your experience to some scenario that you just read. How did you go about preparing for those?
Yeah, so there's actually, this is definitely a good thing to talk about is, a lot of, I would say, a good, that what we were saying before, the CASPer is 12 sections, and maybe not all of them, maybe half will ask you to bring in some personal detail, like think about a time you demonstrated this or had this ethical conundrum, right? So they're asking you to bring in your personal experience. And I would say here is like, all of us have kind of the necessary background. You've been in a situation that can be applicable to this, because the scenarios they're describing are everyday events. And I think the key is this, that's not something you're going to be able to come up with on the spot if you're taking it, the CASPer, the first time you're thinking about it is when you take the test. So as you're going through the practice questions, kind of keep a list of, these kind of common events that have happened in your life. Like my friend John and I had this problem, or me and my brother did this. And you keep, you can make an Excel column, you can probably just do it on paper, and, have that somehow categorized, like this scenario, what are kind of like the things that you could talk about from this, CASPer type questions. There was an ethical dilemma, or, I had an issue with this. Keep a list, memorize those, like enough to the point where you can recall it if needed. And then, as you're practicing, kind of learn to go back to those scenarios, learn to be able to write that in a succinct way where you describe the necessary details and connect it back, because all that practice will be helpful. But the key takeaway is having, 10 stories or something that you can kind of pull out of your bag when you need to will make this whole process really easy, because everyone has them. You just have to be able to recall them. And that's a lot easier if you've thought about it before and you're not just thinking about it for the first time on test day. Because like we said, it's time, and that there's just not enough time to think really hard and deeply about it on test day. But if you prepare, it's not too bad.
And as you go through different practice questions, you can also note down the types of scenarios that are brought up and create your own bank of types of experiences that you might have to relate to. So if the scenario is about resolving a conflict between you and another colleague, right? You can say, oh, do I have a similar experience? Do I have an experience where I had a conflict or a disagreement with someone I worked with? And make a note about that and how you would express that, and build up your reservoir essentially of experiences.
Yeah, I like that word bank. You want a bank of stories, like a question bank here, or like a word bank. You want a bank of stories that you can relate to the CASPer. I like that, the way you put that.
So it sounds like you had a few different techniques. First of all, you understood and maybe even researched some themes in medicine, confidentiality, patient autonomy, so that you could understand how to answer those scenario questions. You made sure that you could identify the question types, and then you also prepared a personal question bank, let's say, where you had some of those responses ready. And I think that segues really well into interviews, which of course you basically need to have a strategy similar to that for your interviews. When did you start preparing for your interviews?
Yeah, so I probably started preparing maybe like by first week of August, second week of August. I would recommend, like, ideally, the earlier the better for given applicant. If we're thinking about the 2-week rule, you might be done with your secondaries, second, third week of July, because a lot of these come in July 1st. So, it's completely understandable. Take a few days off, even a week might be okay. But the sooner you start with the interviews, the better. And like I said before, they're saying, early bird gets the word, and kind of like, sacrifice during the summer, so you'll have this better outcomes with your application. I know it can be difficult at times, but so yeah, I started preparing first, second week of August, kind of doing a mixture of, mock interviews, kind of using this like the simulated interview where, you can kind of record yourself or practice going through a prompt from the kind of interview question bank. And I mean, I think it's something, you want to start early, you want to do it kind of routinely and often, just to kind of get used to answering questions like in that format, which, we're not necessarily used to in our everyday life, and get used to the question types, because they are sometimes a little bit they're not tricky always, but some of them are tricky, and you just want to be able to respond in a way that's thoughtful and cogent. So, but I think you can get really better at them quite fast. And then that's kind of the cognitive aspect of it, figuring out how to put it in a good way. And then, whether you do it with, you're just practicing in your living room with your mom and dad, or recording yourself doing it or working with, I worked with some like live people with the BeMo, with the mock sessions. You want to see how you come across, whether it is virtual or in person. What's your body language like? Is your eye contact good? Is kind of because the, nonverbal communication is really important, and some of that might be more memorable than even what you say. So you want to master both aspects of that in terms of interviewing.
Now, you mentioned mom and dad. I don't know about you, Rishi. I don't know if you practiced with your parents, but if I practiced with my parents, I would get no useful feedback from them.
No, that's completely fair. I use that as kind of a colloquial, but it's probably better if you have maybe a friend who's also applying to med school. You can be each other's, and I think the thing nice about that is sometimes you can see what people do well, right? Like you can see like, what is it about them that makes me very comfortable? And it's if you have a friend, I think that can be helpful too, watching other people do it, and that way you can kind of both do it for each other. Yeah, I agree with you. Mom and dad might not be the way to go. It could be a little bit weird.
Yeah. I mean, they always mean well when they give you feedback, but it may not always help you out in the end. But even friends, it's hard when you've never actually been on the other side to know, what kind of feedback to give. So like if you have the opportunity, work with someone who can give you the kind of feedback that will actually get you to a place where you could be accepted, right? Maybe that's someone who's done medical school interviews or just any kind of professional interviews before. Maybe it's someone like a professor or someone who has a little bit of experience and knows what the difference is between a successful candidate and an unsuccessful candidate. And you mentioned the nonverbal cues, Rishi. I think that's so important. I don't know that any of my friends would be able to point out concretely exactly what I was doing wrong if I was doing anything wrong in an interview setting in terms of nonverbal communication. I'm not sure that they would be able to say, you're not making enough eye contact, or I noticed that you were doing this with your feet. They're probably focusing on your answer and the contents of what you're saying, right? Which is what most people will likely gravitate towards, but certainly someone who is a professional could give you that kind of advice. Did you get, how did you realize that was important?
Yeah. So I think, I would say like when I did my mock interviews, one of the first things I realized, like they'll give you like certain small, part of it is they haven't met you before. So they're gonna be, the way they interact with you is different than when, your friends or anyone interacts with you, because they know you and they're not necessarily meeting you for the first time, but they'll bring up small details about your posture and maintaining eye contact and things like that you just don't think of, because most of us are not thinking about like nonverbal communication, and most of us are probably, more, if anything, thinking about like, is my answer going to sound really smart and cogent? So I think that's what I realized, but also this generally, I mean, even outside of, I think, the application cycle, it is very important to have those nonverbal cues kind of mastered. So this is something that'll be important, but I think it's something hard. If you don't know, it's something hard to understand, but when someone points it out, you can see like, oh, I get that. So like, making sure your feet, if you are interviewing in person, you want to make sure your feet and body are pointed towards them, so they know that you are interested. Maintaining eye contact, not looking away, those things. Because most of us, I think we maintain eye contact, but it tells some, either, you'll see it on someone, when someone points it out, you realize you don't. So those are the things you want to make sure someone is pointing out for you. And like you were saying, I think there are like kind of, levels to preparing. The best is to do it with someone who is kind of a professional at this, who doesn't know you, so who's really judging you like a kind of an interviewer would, or an interviewer would. Practicing with your friends or family is it's at least you're practicing in front of a live being. You're getting used to like your volume and eye contact and all those things are important. And then maybe it's not, there's still time, there's times where you're going to have to do it because of practicality reasons, practicing in front of yourself, with yourself in front of a computer, recording yourself, that there's not, you have to do that too. But kind of just making sure you span the whole spectrum and do at least a little bit of, I think, if you can, the first thing I mentioned, practicing with real questions under time constraints with a kind of a professional, I think is really helpful and high yield.
Yeah, if you know that the nonverbal cues are important and you know what to look for, you can definitely monitor yourself by recording yourself and replaying it and rewatching it, and then making notes and working on specific things the next time around for sure. Yeah,
definitely.
And I think one thing that you pointed out again is these realistic simulations, and there's something about interviewing with someone who makes you feel slightly uncomfortable that is more like a real thing. You know, we always say reading a book about biking and actually biking are very different things. So using these very realistic simulations that give you that same feeling of anxiety, because as you said, you know, if you're with your family or your friends or by yourself recording yourself, you're not going to feel that level of anxiety that you would if you're with the doctor or some kind of interview professional. So then you can actually work through those anxieties as they come up.
Yeah, perfectly said, and you're completely right. It's just not, you know, there's certain aspects of it that you can't recreate if you know the person, and working with someone you haven't met before really properly simulates what an actual interview is going to be like when you don't know the interviewers, whoever is interviewing you.
Yeah. So, so did you go from 0 interview invites the first time that you applied?
Yeah, I actually had 0 interview invites the first time I applied. So yeah, that maybe tells people that the secondaries were extremely late. So you don't definitely get those in better than I did the first time.
And can I ask how many interview invites did you get the second time around?
Yes, I got 6 interview invites the second time around, so it's quite an improvement. And this, you know, if you get your secondary invites, secondaries in on time, you will get some. So I hope my example can show you that the importance of doing the application properly, even if you have good, you know, a good application on paper.
Yeah, and I'm sure the content didn't hurt either. Definitely.
Yes.
Beefing up that personal statement, activity sketch, and the secondaries as well, rewriting those.
Exactly, right. That part is what changed, right? Like the change from 0 to 6 was doing all the application stuff, all the kind of the peer application strategy more deliberately and more proactively.
Yeah, and in terms of the types of interviews, because you know there's MMI, there can be a traditional panel, which is usually a one-on-one or with a number of people, whereas MMI are timed. It's more like a CASPer, like some scenario, maybe policy, personal questions, and you have different rooms where you have a limited amount of time to answer the question. And sometimes you can also have group interviews. So what types of interviews were yours?
All of my interviews, from what I recall, were hybrid in the sense that they had like an MMI aspect where there were these shorter kind of station-like questions, and then the more traditional long-form interviews with a physician or someone like that. So they were hybrid in that sense.
For the hybrid, like between MMI and panel, did you find one more challenging than another? What was your experience like?
I think I personally found MMI a little bit more challenging because I think, you know, just by nature, some of the scenarios are, you know, a little bit unusual, things you're less used to talking about. You know, it helps to prepare for MMI. I think MMI you can improve very quickly if you just practice, whereas kind of the traditional interview, a lot of it is things you've maybe mentioned in your personal statement or secondaries. And if you're just like, I think a good talker in a way, you can kind of work your way through that and just have a natural free-flowing conversation, whereas MMI is not that kind of active, kind of that type of interview. So personally for me, felt it was more natural to have the traditional interview, but you know, maybe there are people I think who could go the other way. So I think a little bit of it will come down to your personal preference.
Yeah, the traditional interviews, you're drawing on your own experiences, which presumably you know well, right? Because they're your experiences, whereas the MMIs will throw you questions that ask you to speak on things that, you know, you're probably thinking about for the very first time outside of the room.
Exactly.
So that definitely could be a little bit challenging.
And I think that just gets back to the importance of the MMI. Like, I know I used it, and there's lots of places online where you can find these. I used, I think there was a kind of an interview question bank from BeMo, and I know there are others, just online, so you can definitely mix and match. But it's helpful to go through a lot of MMI type questions because there are a lot, but there's like kind of like with secondaries, common patterns, I would say.
Yeah.
Because you want to, you're never going to be prepared for the specific random scenario they ask you, because that's, they're probably coming up with it for the first time themselves, the kind of the week before or something like that. But there are these overarching themes, and it's just learning to apply those to it and justify yourself well. And there are some things that are probably even reused. So if you get one of that, that's great. But learning to just understand the broad kind of themes and patterns of MMI is something that is attainable if you do enough practice, and a lot of that you can just do with a simulator, and you don't even to get kind of the breadth of questions under your belt.
Absolutely, and if you can identify the types of questions that you're talking about, and you have a structure or a strategy to approach each one, then that can definitely save you some stress and and mental work as you're trying to come up with your answer, because you already have a framework to work with and you're just filling in the information based on the specifics in the prompt that you've received.
Yeah, and yeah, just to kind of like talk a little in terms of the interview, this is like, if you've gotten to the interview stage, this is the last lap of this long race of getting into medical school. So I know you're, by the time this season runs, you get to this part in the application process, everyone's tired and everyone wants to maybe take it a little easier, but don't do that. Hold yourself to a standard, because it will pay dividends doing these interview practice and things like that. And you'll be glad that you did it when you eventually get admitted to these places. And you should prepare, but also feel confident, because the fact that you got interviews means that these med schools see something in you that they like. Their interview time is very limited, right? Because there's there's only so many interview slots, and the people who are interviewing you are typically very busy. They're either on the admissions committee or physicians themselves, so they don't just hand these out to everybody. So you should feel confident that they liked you, but also prepare and give it your best effort. So when you get there, feel confident, but also put in the work.
Yeah, you make a really good point, and I think you've talked a lot about how to prepare for the MMI portion, and also it's really similar to CASPer. And then you have that panel or one-on-one, and I think it's important for students to know what types of questions are common. So tell us about yourself, why medicine is really common, and why our school. And then you can have open or closed, and sometimes they can have access to your documents and ask you about specific things from your past. So did you find that that was the case? Were those the kind of the common questions, and did you get asked about your own documents?
I believe I got asked about I don't remember very specifically, but like you said, there are some schools where it's open and some where it's closed, and I think it's split. It's pretty split pretty evenly. So my advice for that would be just know your application well, and they might there's no this isn't something you need on maybe specific. If you can think of things that they might ask, do, but a lot of the times they might ask you about a specific research project you're involved in, or something that resonates with that specific person. I think at the end of the day, this should be the easy part, because most likely what you put down in your application really well. You probably know better than anyone, and so just talk about it and be enthusiastic about that, because I think sometimes with those, it's not necessarily exactly what you say, but how you say it, and showing that you are enthusiastic about it. And it's important to show that connect it back to what it always try to sell a certain trait of yourself, or make that aspect of the application work for you, like you said so earlier. But show enthusiasm when you're talking about that research project you were involved in, or that hospital thing, right? Because at the end of the day, they think these things matter to you, and you want to confirm that. So even I think saying it in a certain way helps a lot there.
And I think we've been talking about the similarity and the overlap between the content of what gets discussed in the interviews and what you do before, including the CASPer, which is very similar to MMI, the personal statements and activity sketches and secondaries, which include a lot, if not all of the information they would probably want to ask you about in the interview. So there is this question of what is the point of the interview, right? It's like a final screen. What are they looking for? And in my experience, it's really, they want to see who you are as a person off the page. It's that they want to make that final decision of, are you going to be an effective physician in terms of working with your future patients, working with your future colleagues, your team, all that kind of stuff. And some of that does not come out in written form, right? You can talk about your experiences really well in written form, but then if you're so nervous when you're sitting in front of the interviewer that you can't express yourself, then they can't be confident in your ability to speak with your patients with confidence and assurance, right? You should be the confident one, the professional one in that setting. So there's those aspects, but you're absolutely right in saying that they've selected you for a reason to go into that interview stage, and so you just want to present yourself as who you are genuinely and present yourself in a way that demonstrates that you are suitable for a future profession where you will be engaging a lot one-on-one in group settings with other human beings.
Yeah, perfect. Well, really well said. I agree with everything you said. And the interview is, some schools more than other, but a very important part of your evaluation. And I've heard stories that at certain schools that by the time you get to the interview stage, they kind of like the slate clean, in that they assume they're kind of thus evaluating the interview at that point. Now, maybe that's this like kind of like legend, and I don't know how accurate that is, but it is definitely an important part. And this, don't be nervous about it. Just prepare well and look at it as another opportunity to sell yourself and make that part of it work for you. I think everyone has traits and aspects of themselves that they like, think are positive, and just try to emphasize those in the interview when you can. And for the more kind of cookie cutter questions where you're just answering scenarios, show that you have done the work and answer it the way you think a good physician would, and you'll be all right. And I think for the most part, I think compared to secondaries, which I found really like tedious and kind of like academic in a way, because you're writing and it's very like you have such a it's more like writing based. I think interviews can be a little bit more lighthearted and fun, because you're just talking, right? You can have fun with it. You will see you'll get better at it at time really well, just as you're comfortable with the questions and the setting.
That's awesome. I think that is a mindset people should have when going into their interviews. It's not a test. I mean, it kind of is, but you don't want to think about it as a test and psych yourself out. You can think of it more as an opportunity to showcase who you are. Right?
Exactly.
And I think something you said earlier is such great advice, that you should show enthusiasm and be excited to be there, and try to show that you're passionate about their school. And you can do that by doing a little bit of research about their school, including that some things, and also something that's really great, such a kind of like interview hack, is just great introductions and conclusions. Be kind, appreciative to be there, appreciative of their time, say their name back to them. These little things can really showcase that respect and excitement.
Exactly. Yeah, those are all great tips.
So obviously you did really well in your interviews. Did you, after you finished your interviews, did you send any kind of thank you letters or update letters or anything like that?
Yeah. So right after your interviews, typically, I think, especially like when I did it, it was on Zoom, so it was a little bit easier to like write down the name quickly, especially of the physicians who emailed me different places. So I think it's a good idea to send, a thank you email. You can send them this like, thank you for interviewing me. I had a nice time talking with you. I hope you have a nice weekend. Nothing too, fancy. It doesn't have to be an essay. They probably are not interested in reading that, but just be, polite, cordial, and I think, it's just a good thing to do. Even outside your application, most of these physicians, the ones who are interviewing you, are quite busy, and they're probably not getting, hugely compensated for this in any real way. They're just interested in making sure that people who get into their med school are, good and representing the school well. So, this kind of show that respect and cordiality.
Yeah, that's a great tip. And we normally would suggest to send it pretty quickly, like 1 to 2 days after the interview, because they can be interviewing multiple people multiple days.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip for students. And in the end, we would like to ask, how many acceptances did you receive, and which school did you end up choosing and why?
Yeah, so I received 3 acceptances, and I ended up choosing to come, like I said before, I'm here at the CASPer College of Medicine at the University of Iowa. And I chose it for a couple of reasons. It was, I was coming from California. It was the highest ranked program I got into of the 3. So that was, a big plus for me. I think it is, important to consider that when you're picking a place, because these things can matter for things like in the future, like residency and stuff like that. In terms of another thing that, will inevitably drive decisions is cost. And in this case, the cost of this place was actually pretty comparable to the comparable and better than one of the other places I got into in California, because it is like a lower cost of living state, and it is a public school, so a little bit overall a little bit cheaper than, like, certain private schools. And then thirdly, 2 more left actually. So I like how this is like an undergraduate university, so some kind of medical schools are more attached to like health sciences university. And there's nothing wrong with that, but if you're interested in like certain types of research, it is helpful for kind of the interdisciplinary nature of certain research to be fostered at some of these bigger academic institutions. So for example, I did in the kind of as a before my first year, I did like a summer research program here in the University of Iowa with a neuroimaging study looking at aneurysms in the brain. And a lot of the work done with that involved like doctors in the hospital collaborating with people in bioengineering in the university. So those things are a little bit easier when you're at a big undergraduate university. So those are, if you are interested in kind of research, that's one thing to think about. It's sometimes easier at these big undergraduate universities. And this lastly, depending on where you are, so some medical schools are associated with like big tertiary care centers, places that are kind of like the final spot of treatment for a big geographic or maybe just a highly populated area. And that when you get to your M3, M4 years, your clinical years is good, because you'll see a lot of kind of interesting academic cases and just a good amount of case volume in general, which is good as a medical student, because they might need you to do things and this allow you to be exposed to more things than if you were maybe in an area that had lots of hospitals and you're rotating at one of the many hospitals in the area. So overall, I think those are the kinds of things you should think about when you get into medical school. Rankings matter. Think about cost. Think about like what kind of place do you want to be at? Do you want to be at like a undergraduate, big undergraduate university? Do you like kind of maybe like a smaller health sciences type school? Are you more interested in like being near a tertiary care center? And then maybe finally, depending on how important it is to you, if geography matters. And so I think that's a good problem to have, and I hope everyone listening to this eventually has lots of different medical schools to think about and choose from. And that can be its own challenge when you get there, but like I said, it's a good problem to have. And I think no matter where you end up, you can just make the most of it, and you'll end up being a great doctor at the end of the day. Either way, it's have a positive attitude when you get there.
Absolutely. And it's not always that people have options when they do receive their acceptances. So what you said at the end there, I think really resonates for those people, because at the end of the day, any education that you receive at a medical school in the States, in North America, is probably going to be good, and you should make the most of it, right? Enjoy it for what it is. And there are always more opportunities to expand and grow afterwards, because as you know, your medical education training doesn't end. at
Exactly.
medical school.
Yeah, and is there anything that you would want to say to future applicants who, might be nervous about the whole application process, and, particularly for a reapplicant like yourself, who might be concerned even about if they should apply again?
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely a couple of things I kind of just to I'd like to communicate to any applicants, whether they're first-time applicants or reapplicants. I think first off, kind of something we said at the beginning of this. Sometimes it does feel like medical school admissions is a little bit random, and there's no kind of rhyme or reason to why certain people get in, why other people don't. And there is a little bit of this randomness to it, but at the end of the day, you can't kind of let yourself get too stressed out about the parts you can control. What you should focus on is on that there are things you can do that have been very well, I would say, that are established that will help you get into good places and help you get into more places. So focus on the part you can control. Like we were talking about earlier, if you take one thing away from this video, I think it's in June, pre-write those secondaries and it'll make a big difference. So this being diligent, intentional and proactive throughout the whole process will make a huge difference and allow you to hopefully get in earlier, which is a really great feeling. And in terms of I know it can be a stressful process, but focus on what you can control. Don't let it, affect your mental health too negatively. Just get the work done, and kind of the results will take care of themselves. And then in terms of the reapplicants, I've been there. I know it's really frustrating having to deal with it a second time, and it can become a sort of something in the back that creeps in the back of your head and causes you self-doubt. What I'd say is, it's okay. This whole thing, it's like, in the grand scheme of all things in life and all the things people have to deal with, 1 year, spending kind of an additional year applying to med school, it's not the end of the world. But, it's okay to acknowledge that it wasn't the outcome you're hoping for. Just identify what you could have done better, whether that's something, you need to expand upon a certain section of your application, or like me, just be a little bit more intentional with your application. But all things considered, don't let it get you too down. There's lots of challenges in life, and this is just something you have to overcome. And when you get into medical school, you'll have lots of things to worry about, but one of them, I don't think what'll keep you up at night then will be the year you lost while you were waiting for med school. Ultimately, you'll just forget about it and be like, oh yeah, that happened, but whatever, I'm here and now. So use that as motivation. Everything really does work out, but I understand it can be more difficult going through the second time. So if it's okay to, be a little bit frustrated about that, but just, don't, get up, get back on your feet and go through it, and it'll all work out. And if you need help, seek some, find someone like I work with BeMo to kind of give you the guidance you need to make sure you get in this time.
Great, thank you. I think you had so many little nuggets of information and advice that are going to be so helpful, not only for reapplicants, but for first-time applicants as well. You've kind of gone above and beyond, sharing all aspects of your journey, including your stats and everything. We really appreciate it, and we know everyone who's watching or listening appreciates it as well. So we would really like to thank you for joining us, and wish you the best in terms of your long medical school process and residency in the future. So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you to you both as well for allowing me to participate in this. It was really fun, and I hope people find it helpful and useful in their own journey to applying to medical school. Yeah, and thank you both so much.
Thank you. And for anyone who is watching this and is interested in how BeMo can help you on your application journey, do visit BeMoFreeStrategy.com to book your free initial consultation, and we would love to talk to you.